Our battle, our struggle is to create art. Our weapon is the moving picture. Because we have the moving picture, our paintings will grow and recede. Our poetry will be shadows that lengthen and conceal. Our light will play across living faces that laugh and agonize. And our music will linger and finally overwhelm because it will have a context as certain as the grave. We are scientists engaged in the creation of memory. But our memory will neither blur nor fade.
Through the medium of light, movement, sound, and shadow, filmmakers are capable of creating iconic images and sequences that linger with us long after the credits have stopped rolling. We are able to be imprinted with images of intense beauty or visceral terror, and it is no surprise that, throughout the history of cinema, some of the most iconic moments are sourced from horror films. Though genre films have traditionally been viewed as a lesser medium by film critics and scholars alike, one cannot ignore the overwhelming impact that they have had upon the world of film, and horror is no exception. Indeed, the history of the horror film runs so tangentially to the history of filmmaking itself that one can scarcely discuss one without the other. In the late Victorian era of the 19th century, the bookshelves were lined with Gothic stylings of authors such as Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, H.G. Wells, and Robert Louis Stevenson. And in Paris, the Lumiere brothers were shocking the world with the advent of the motion picture. Among those who were enraptured by the invention of cinema was Georges Méliès, a renowned stage magician. Born of the craze of spiritualism and paranormal conjuring, stage magic was a burgeoning craze in and of itself. And through projected images, Méliès saw limitless possibilities for their inclusions in stage shows, projecting flickering images onto stage smoke to create ghostly apparitions. Prior to Méliès, the usage of the motion picture had primarily been that of capturing life as it was to the contemporary viewer. An image of a city street had been a real city street. The footage of a man walking had been a living person once upon a time, made of flesh and blood. Yet Méliès, from his background as a magician, rejected the idea that fantasy and imagination had no place in the world of film. And in 1897, nearly 5 years before sending man to the moon, Georges Méliès introduced the world's first horror film, Le Manoir du Diable. Though catchpenny by today's standards, one cannot help but wonder how a film consisting of such superficial frights such as ghosts in sheets and bats upon a string could possibly terrify audiences. Méliès nevertheless touched upon a crucial point of understanding, that audiences could empathize with the same fear and dread as the film's subjects. The genre film had been born, and the French community soon bestowed an appropriate name for it, Féerie or Le Fantastique. As escapist as these films were, however, reality would soon prove more terrifying than anything Méliès conjured. World War I, and the aftermath, left Europe a land filled with artistic unrest. And from this nihilistic, pessimistic attitude, the German Expressionist movement gathered enormous momentum in a populace that had experienced the nightmare of the trenches. Rebelling against the stiff, Victorian ideals of poise and emotional sterility, the Expressionists were raw and unrestrained, unafraid of the introspection of the human psyche and the darkness that lay within. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in 1920, shocked its audiences with bizarre, otherworldly sets and title cards. And while it didn't open to universal praise, the film very quickly became one of the most talked about movies in Europe. Curiosity, morbid or otherwise, prompted France to lift its ban on the showing of German films, simply to experience it firsthand. Controversy and confusion, however, lit a spark of inspiration across the world of cinema, and the term Caligariism soon began to be used to describe films that shared the same sense of the strange and unusual. And soon enough, imitators quickly tried to capitalize on the scandalous success of Dr. Caligari. Though Caligari's influence was not limited to Germany alone, Swedish filmmaker Benjamin Christensen, who, after buying a copy of the medieval text on witchcraft, the Malleus Maleficarum, was inspired to create Häxan, or Witchcraft Through the Ages. Unabashed in its depiction of violence, torture, blasphemy, and even sexual perversion, the film sets the precedent of horror being on the cutting edge of censorship and controversy, always pushing the line of what is to be considered acceptable, a debate that would be echoed in the decades to come. The film also features a bizarre hybrid of documentary and narrative storytelling, nearly 80 years before another documentary on witchcraft would frighten viewers and cause them to question just what was truth and what was fiction.
I'm scared to close my eyes. I'm scared to open them.
German filmmakers soon began to call these Schauerfilme, or films of fantasy and terror. And in 1921, a symphony of terror would strike its first chord. By the early 20th century, Bram Stoker's Dracula had become a worldwide sensation, and the German Schauerfilme studio Prana Films sought to bask in the shadow of the vampiric count. When Stoker's widow, however, denied the film rights to the novel, producer and occultist Albin Grau sought a unique loophole. By changing the story's setting from Victorian London to 1830s Bremen, and by changing the name Count Dracula to Count Orlok, Prana Films then hired noted director F.W. Murnau to bring the story of Nosferatu to life. Though lauded for its creative use of shadow and darkness, Nosferatu was considered to be an outdated piece of schlock, even by the standards of the time, with many of its special effects coming across as comical rather than supernatural. What's worse, the Stoker estate were unsatisfied with Prana's protective measures, and the subsequent lawsuits bankrupted the studio. However, in spite of all of this, Nosferatu's legacy continues to this very day. Chief among the reasons for its sustained popularity is the performance and the appearance of its lead, Max Schreck, who played the titular monster. In its earliest days, most films featured makeup of rather modest means. Ladies would be adorned with cosmetics, while false beards or eyebrows would be applied to villainous characters, and without the existence of makeup departments, most actors were expected to provide and apply their own. And it was one man's talents as an artist and an actor that gave horror its first movie star. Dubbed the Man of a Thousand Faces, Lon Chaney's roots as a theatrical performer endowed him with the skills needed to manipulate his appearance using early prosthetics and other makeup techniques, many of which were of his own invention. Having completely transformed himself to play the role of the misshapen Quasimodo in Universal Studios' The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the film went on to achieve unparalleled financial success. Believing in the star power of Chaney, Universal subsequently cast him as the lead role in 1923's The Phantom of the Opera. According to rumor, Lon Chaney's ghoulish facade had been inspired by many of the deformities seen on soldiers returning home from Europe, and the effect was incredible. When the young ingenue, Christine, finally pulls the mask from the Phantom's face, the audience was said to have reacted with screams and spells of fainting. Yet in spite of all of this, viewers kept coming back again and again and again. And by the mid-1920s, Universal had cemented itself as the studio of monster films, with the release of such films as The Cat and the Canary and The Man Who Laughs, which combined the talents of the Phantom's Mary Philbin and Caligari's Conrad Veidt. By the 1930s, the term horror film had officially been coined. And in classical Hollywood, Universal continued to reign supreme. Yet their success would reach new bounds with the advent of the talkie picture, and with the introduction of its newest stars. In 1931, Todd Browning's Dracula served as an adaptation of the 1924 stage play, casting the star of the original Broadway cast to reprise his role as Count Dracula. The Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi had immigrated to America after fleeing the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and had quickly found success as a stage actor in New York City, finding his eyes to be hypnotic with an accent that many consider to be both exotic and menacing.
I am Dracula.
While pulled from the same literary source as Nosferatu, the film lacks many of the sweeping exotic locations of the novel and instead focuses on the more reserved parlor aesthetic of the stage play. Though its acclaim was great, Universal's next monstrous creation would soon overtake its predecessor.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
William Henry Pratt, the child of a British Indian family, struggled with speech impediments as a child before attending and subsequently dropping out of King's College in London. Moving from odd job after odd job, Pratt then immigrated to Canada, where he began acting under the stage name Boris Karloff. In stark contrast to his vampiric counterpart, Karloff struggled for many years before attaining any sort of studio recognition. Whereas Lugosi headlined marquees on stage and screen, Karloff had dozens of films under his belt, but mainly as a bit part, which often required him to perform menial tasks on the side, helping to rig the lighting or carry set pieces before finally getting into costume. When Universal began production on Frankenstein, the role was, ironically, originally offered to Lugosi, who promptly left the cast after realizing that his face would be heavily modified by prosthetics and makeup. After being featured in over 80 films, director James Whale stumbled upon Karloff while searching the edited dailies of another film, and was struck by his unique appearance. Where the Count was refined with a sort of lordly elegance, the creature simply stared with a vacant expression that, even today, remains incredibly unsettling. Both Lugosi and Karloff, through their portrayals of these characters, have since entered into the public zeitgeist. And though each of these films, and by extension their originating novels, have been adapted countless times, it is the faces of Karloff and Lugosi that come to mind whenever one mentions Frankenstein or Dracula, a testament to the popularity of these films and the lasting impression of the Hollywood star approach. Frankenstein was, similarly, unique in its composition. Unburdened by the cramped settings of Dracula, Frankenstein offered viewers sweeping vistas and true Gothic romance. What's more, the film sought to push the boundaries of acceptability.
No, you're hurting me! No!
But in Whale's Frankenstein, a girl is killed by the creature in a sequence that is unapologetic as it is chilling. Numerous theater patrons and even government representatives complained of what they considered to be a blasphemous and grotesque showcase, and as a result, was banned from numerous states and countries abroad. As a result, Universal made several cuts to the film, and it is because of this controversy that many attribute Frankenstein to be the film that launched what would be known as the Motion Picture Association of America, an oversight committee concerned with the maintaining of censorship and cultural decency. James Whale, however, took the complaints in stride, perhaps proud of having shaken up the status quo. Given Whale's status as a closeted homosexual man, it is not outside the realm of believability that his experiences lended themselves to the direction of the monster as a social outcast, a being that was ultimately human but, for whatever reason, was met by his fellows with scorn and disgust. This worldview would become increasingly prevalent in Whale's 1935 film The Bride of Frankenstein, a follow-up to the original. In Bride, Whale abandons an overtly dour tone of horror in favor of something more lighthearted and, at times, even humorous, conceivably giving birth to what we would eventually know as camp. This over-exaggerated sense of pageantry used as a means to disturb and unsettle those of a more straight-laced sensibility while delighting those on the fringes would live on in the works of Richard O'Brien and more recently in the colorfully morbid displays of Ryan Murphy. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Universal would continue its foray into horror, and the genre that helped introduce the world to both the sequel and the remake also began to introduce concepts such as the crossover, creating a cinematic universe long ahead of its time. As with much of classical Hollywood, Universal's horror films relied upon the star power of big names to draw their audiences. With Lugosi and Karloff often competing for numerous roles, other names such as Lon Chaney Jr. and Claude Rains began to enter into the pantheon. Oftentimes, these character stories would interact with each other, such as in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, confusedly starring Bela Lugosi as the creature this time.
Let's barricade the door. Come on, get it over there. Get in there. Okay, come on. Come on. Put your shoulder to the door. Hold it tight. We'll barricade it. He can't get in.
By 1948, however, Universal Monsters had all but run its course, with the final nail in the coffin being Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, a comedy parody that seemed all too self-aware of the fact that these characters had overstayed their welcome and became more like eccentric family members than monsters hiding under our bed. By the end of World War II, the world was no longer afraid of the Gothic castles of the past, but rather the terrifying possibilities of the future. The Atomic Age ushered in a new era of anxieties for the world, and the cinema of the age reflected that. Films such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers reflected the fears of communists living amongst the American populace. Mindless automatons meant to blend within suburban communities, whose sole goal was to convert those around them to the same joyless existence. Other films, such as It Came From Beneath the Sea, pondered the still unknown effects of nuclear testing. As popular as these films were with American audiences, however, they would soon be overshadowed by a far more gargantuan creature. In 1954, just 9 short years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan introduced the world to Gojira, Ishiro Honda's timely allegory for a post-nuclear Japan. Awakened by the atomic testing on the Bikini Atoll, the monstrous Godzilla arises from the depths to wreak havoc upon Japan, before scientists discover that the only means of defeating him is an even more powerful, dangerous, and destructive weapon. This plot point offers an obvious parallel on both the dangers of nuclear testing and how quickly our own creations may get out of our hands. In the struggle to create something more destructive than the last, we may ultimately create the implements of our own destruction. Despite the franchise enjoying ongoing popularity, which continues even to this day, initial reception to Godzilla was less than warm, with many critics considering it to be an insensitive exploitation of the suffering of the Japanese people after the war. It was only after the film received critical success in the United States and other markets overseas that many Japanese filmgoers began to reevaluate their initial dismissal. While Hollywood had largely turned its back on Gothic horror, the legacy of Frankenstein and Dracula continued to permeate the rest of the filmmaking world well into the 1950s and 60s. While previously focusing upon westerns and lucha libre wrestling films, the Mexican film industry soon became enamored with the horror genre, and the low budgets that they often required. Bankrolled by actor-turned-executive Abel Salazar, Mexican horror films first simply copied the original Universal fare, before gradually evolving into something entirely unique. To Salazar, the humble special effects of the classical horror films were not something that he was hamstrung by, but rather were deliberate choices that he felt were part and parcel with the genre of horror itself. This sentiment was hardly ubiquitous, however, and much like what was experienced in Hollywood years earlier, audiences soon began to grow tired of the same old fare. And as Mexico's film industry became nationalized, genre films such as horror became increasingly less relevant. Undeterred by the lack of funding, independent filmmakers soon took up the yoke and continued in the tradition of horror. One such filmmaker, by the name of Juan Lopez Moctezuma, felt restrained by the studio system, and in an effort to introduce his own brand of terror, Moctezuma collaborated with French-Chilean surrealist Alejandro Jodorowsky to create a subgenre of horror marked by its infusion of local Catholic sentimentality with the aesthetics of the avant-garde. The result was a shocking psychedelic orgy of violence and sexuality, hereto unknown outside of European art house cinema. Calling itself Panic Cinema, as an allusion to the Greek god Pan, the film sought to revel in their own sin and indecency. As writer for the Paris Voice Molly Grogan stated, Panic Cinema used their extreme displays of violence and lust as a means of releasing destructive energies in order to arrive at sustained peace and beauty. Distinguished by these grotesque visuals paired with bizarre and chaotic performance art, the Panic films drew much infamy and acclaim around the world as they did at home. This aesthetic of beauty and blasphemy would go on to inspire the work of contemporary Mexican horror director Guillermo del Toro, while at the time also drawing the attention of European director Roman Polanski, who brought this approach to his first mainstream American film, Rosemary's Baby.
His power is stronger than stronger. His might shall last longer than longer. Yes, Satan!
No! It can't be!
The film went on to become a financial and critical success, in and of itself beginning its own string of imitators, obsessed with capturing the perverse and the satanic on celluloid. Meanwhile in Europe, while art house theaters and cinemateurs had swept up in the French New Wave, Italian filmmakers had begun experimenting with their very own unique genre. Based on the American tradition of pulp novels, Italian filmmakers drew inspiration from their very own giallo paperback publications. Giallo, an Italian word meaning yellow, derived from the vibrant colors used upon the covers. Co-opting the name, Italian giallo films initially began as detective mysteries, in the vein of Agatha Christie. However, they soon became infused with the eerie suspense of the works of Alfred Hitchcock. This Hitchcockian influence becoming markedly apparent in Mario Bava's 1962 film La ragazza che sapeva troppo, or The Woman Who Knew Too Much, based off of two films Hitchcock had previously made. Giallo films, or gialli, tend to follow specific conventions, including a mysterious murderer whose identity was usually concealed within a mask, black-gloved hands that execute grisly murders in shocking or often inventive ways, usually upon women who behave vainly or promiscuously, and finally, an amateur sleuth, often a woman and, even more frequently, the target of the killer herself. With all of these leitmotifs, it's easy to see how giallo became the primary inspiration for the trend of American slasher films that would begin to permeate within the mid-1970s. Though such films did not often have a supernatural element to them, one notable example is Dario Argento's 1977 film Suspiria, a harrowing tale about an American ballet dancer named Susie studying abroad in Germany. As many of her classmates are mysteriously killed one by one, Susie begins to hunt down this mysterious assailant. Yet with every clue she uncovers, more and more of her sanity begins to slip, and her sense of reality begins to fade. Suspiria's use of color and vibrancy contrasts itself heavily with the dull, lifeless tones usually found within slasher films. And inspired by the work of Jean-Luc Godard and the avant-garde films of the French Nouveau Vague, Argento uses color to play with our senses of perception. Combined with overbearing set pieces and winding corridors meant to evoke insanity and delirium, he is utilizing techniques first set down by Caligari nearly 60 years earlier. Through his sweeping and beautiful visuals juxtaposed with scenes of intense violence and gore, Argento created a film that was as alluring as it was revolting. And Suspiria's influence can be felt in many of the psychological horror films of today, including Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan and Nicholas Winding Refn's The Neon Demon. Italian horror would soon gain even more notoriety with the release of Cannibal Holocaust by director Ruggero Deodato. Veiled in the guise of a legitimate documentary with the tradition of the Italian Mondo films, Cannibal Holocaust details the last fateful expedition of a film crew's foray into the Amazon jungle, only to be beset upon and killed by the local natives. The film is presented as being found footage recovered from the team's camp by an American rescue team. Brutal in its execution, after the film premiered, Deodato found himself arrested and all copies of Cannibal Holocaust seized by the Italian government on suspicion of being an illegitimate snuff film, with Deodato himself reportedly even being charged with murder in connection to the on-screen deaths depicted in the film. It was only after the actors appeared on national talk shows to promote the film and explain that they were not, in fact, actually killed, and one of the more gruesome special effects was recreated for the courts, that the charges against Deodato were eventually dropped. While no humans were truly harmed in the making of Cannibal Holocaust, the film remains equally controversial due to its upsetting and, unfortunately, very real depictions of animal cruelty, which has caused the film to remain banned in several countries. Other critics have decried the depiction of Brazilian natives and the names of actual existing tribes as savage and hedonistic cannibals in what they consider to be nothing more than exploitative at best and overtly racist at worst. In spite of this, or perhaps because of this notoriety, the film has remained one of the most widely discussed and controversial films of all time, continuing to inspire filmmakers such as Eli Roth well into the modern era. Fire! Films are a byproduct of their time, and horror even more so. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, where technological advancements and secular science were making leaps and bounds in progress that had previously been unimaginable. Dracula speaks to the Victorian fears of xenophobia and sexual promiscuity, while Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde explored the depths of the human psyche recently touched upon by Freud. Caligari, itself, almost prophetic in its implicit meaning, captures a society that is chaotic and directionless, until it is revealed that the lunatics are, indeed, running the asylum. And in America that has become numb to the violence seen on the evening news, the slasher film had transformed blood and gore into something that was visually shocking yet emotionally controlled. Viewers could leave the theater stunned, but cathartic. And isn't that what horror is good for? Horror provides a safe space, divorced from ourselves, projected away from ourselves, and onto the canvas screen. By externalizing our fears and our anxieties, we are able to account for them and make sense of them. This becomes even clearer when we look at horror through a global lens. Like many stories, there is a universal element that transcends culture, language, religion, or race. And through manifesting our nightly terrors onto celluloid, we drag them out from under the bed and share them with others for all the world to see.